Now, when you were talking beforehand, it made me think because I had like a specific person in mind, which was, the guy, the teenage boy who plays the video game, says to himself, maybe has a group of friends that are just like him. They all drink Mountain Dew and they laugh at the dumbest things possible. Um, is that a good description?
The shit posters.
Right. And so why is that wrapped up in, or why would they want to be, I said antichrist, but maybe that's not the right word.
It's a descriptor that fits. Why do they want death, destruction?
Right.
I think there's probably a hormonal factor. I think testosterone makes you want to smash shit up. But I also think that these are men, young men, maybe older teenage boys who don't fit the alpha dog mold,
Hmm.
not rough things up, feel very uncomfortable actually when confronted with real world physicality, and yet maintain this male hormonal identity that nonetheless craves some sort of defiance of norms, defiance of structures, defiance of authority, and conquering their own little territory. And it devolved into fantasy, and some of them end up in rabbit holes of pornography, and some of them end up in rabbit holes of violent media and video games. And I don't think they're a threat to society, but they certainly are a threat to their own lives if they expect any wisdom and happiness to come their way. I mean, if this is, it was interesting. I was actually listening to a lot of Jordan Peterson and Camille Paglia at the time I was writing this book. They had an interesting one-on-one right around the time I was writing this book, and they were just talking about everything that was already in my mind that I was trying to infuse into the book. And there are girls who are kind of who fit this mold. It manifests itself differently. It has different interests and different obsessions, but I think ultimately it's an inhibition against the standard ideal. It's people who do not, whatever the standard ideal for the young man, the standard ideal for the young woman, they don't live up to it. They know they don't live up to it, and so they shun it, they shy away from it, they hate it, they resent it, they act against it. Some really great art, I mean, the punk movement comes from that. The late 70s, early 80s punk movement was because these young disaffected men had their own sort of testosterone infused yearnings, but weren't the all-American football player ideal, and so had to carve out their own niche in the world. And football is a very violent sport, so if you're getting your violent impulses out on the field, you don't necessarily, although sometimes it spills over, need to inhabit a world of violence beyond that. If you don't have an outlet for the violence, then maybe your fantasy life is particularly violent. I mean, I think young men who are driven by that hormonal urge, that evolutionary urge, are going to have to figure out a way to express the violent tendency, the violent fantasy that may exist inside of them. And if they don't find a good way to do that, then they're troubling their lives.
All right. And I think to sum that up is I guess befriended some of these people in high school. Not that they were like in group chats like that, but I feel like teenagers, whether it's a guy or girl, even though we've never really seen like a female shooter, or at least I haven't. Um, a lot of these teenagers just want to be seen, especially the ones with the teen angst. They want to be seen, they want to be heard. They're trying to get the attention that they're looking for. And, you know, I think that would be a fair statement to make as I've kind of, I guess, made friends with some of those people. And who knows if me interjecting stopped them from going further, this is all, I don't know.
You
I
showed the
honestly,
friendship, maybe it did, yeah.
right. So maybe they were like, okay, life isn't so bad,
Someone
right?
loves me, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
So
not
that,
a monster. And that's part of the point of my book, is that, maybe not all of them are clinically sociopathic or psychopathic. I mean, look at the mean girl phenomenon, which is the female version of this. The sociopathic mean girl who might be popular, but she's a grotesque figure. She's cruel. She's cruelty incarnate. And it's that cruelty that people are sort of entertained by, but also are fearful of at the same time, because she is a fundamentally antisocial person. And there are many girls who mimic that behavior because for some reason it seems to garner a lot of power. People give power to the things that they fear. And but not all of those girls are clinical sociopaths. Not all of these boys are clinical psychotics. But they sort of glom on to this underbelly, this social underbelly, because they don't feel like, and in some cases they are ostracized from the more normalized mainstream. They are meant to feel like freaks and weirdos by the normalized mainstream. And the normalized mainstream, this is why we're having this bizarre confrontation between the freaks and weirdos and the normalized mainstream right now, because there is no reconciliation there. And perhaps they are they're just two different breeds of character that are irreconcilable. And I don't know what will result in that. But it's certainly very difficult to comport a society with such social extremes. I don't have the answers. I don't know what the resolution is, but there's got to be some way for people to understand themselves, accept themselves, integrate themselves in such a way that they are not pushed to do anything extreme.
Right. Okay, and that brings us to our last question. Is there, because this book is, it's a hard topic, or people will say, oh, it's a difficult topic, but it's not a hard read. Because once you get wrapped into it, it's like, I want to know more. I'm getting pulled in, right? So, is there a future for honest storytelling in the future? So, this is kind of like a three-part question or a two-part question. So, that's the initial question. Is the future for honest storytelling? Wait, is there a future for honest storytelling in the future? And then, why are most readers afraid to experience the truth when it comes to reading, since people like to read to escape? And then, why are topics like school shootings taboo?
That's a lot. That's a
Yeah.
lot. I'll do it as much justice as I can in the short time I can answer it. But what's the first one again?
Is there a future for honest storytelling?
I think there's always a future for honest storytelling. Now, will it be embraced in the future is a different question. I'm an honest storyteller. I'm sure I'm one of many people who are writing stories, screenplays, plays, fiction right now, who are completely ignored, who might be disparaged for it, who might be rejected for it. I've certainly been rejected for it. I mean, when I went to a pitch conference in Manhattan, I was learning how to pitch a book, and I brought with me No Winter Lasts Forever, which is the mass shooting book, and I was just told that we can't be seen supporting this issue, which always sort of struck me odd, because true crime podcasts, nonfiction, documentaries use the real names of the real victims, describing their actual murders in gory detail, and they're making millions from that content. And no one ever criticizes them for, they're not outraged by that financial production. But I write a novel and fictionalize the whole thing, and it's this horrific, immoral transgression. And that's what the agent was literally telling me. We don't want the heat of outrage for making money off of a novel that's about a very serious true crime set of events. And I think it's because nonfiction gives the reader distance. It doesn't involve them, whereas fiction is visceral. It gets you in your gut. You are drawn into the story in such a way that your outrage is provoked. And that's why that happens. It's not because it's any worse than the nonfiction. It's not because that it's more immoral than the true crime producers who are making millions off of that. And I never intended to make millions off of this issue. If I did, what would I do with the money? Would I donate it to causes that maybe, I don't know. I'm just writing, I'm just dramatizing the culture I find myself in. And people either respond to it or they don't. I've moved 2,500 copies of that book. I'm very proud of that because I am completely unsupported by the industry. I mean, I've been blatantly told, white men don't bother, we're not interested. So, aye, Captain, I hear you loud and clear. I'm on my own. Thank you. And so to be able to move those copies on my own is good. I've not made any money from it. I don't really intend to. I don't really see a future for it because, as you say, your other question is there a future for this kind of thing, or the second part of that question? And I'm not really convinced that there is. I think people are so wrapped up in outrage, so willing to condemn and destroy any attempt to artfully and actually illustrate the culture as it is, because it has so many problems, because it is so demoralized. They do not want to confront it. It's not because they necessarily have an interest in it being demoralized, but they cannot tolerate in their own psyches accepting and facing just how bad it's become. And that's what fiction does. It puts you in your face in the issue in your face in an undeniable way. And I think people are really offended by it because they don't want to accept it. And there's nothing I can do about that. What was the other question?
The other question was, why are readers afraid to experience truth? And
I
that
think,
was tied,
yeah.
and that was tied with the theme of this book, because people read to escape. They want to be happy or be in someone else's problems. I'll say problems.
Right.
And I guess as you were talking, I was thinking, because if people wanted to experience truth in this sense, I feel like they will find themselves like Uncle Jack in the book, want to end it. So
Yeah. I get reviews from people who say I didn't want to like this book. The premise really shook me, but you handled it really well and you handled it sensitively, and I was really, really mistaken for my initial prejudice of the content. And I again, that's a huge compliment. I wrote it to try to give it as much truth, as much passionate veracity as I could imbue into this story, based on my personal experience as a teacher, based on just being an American in this society. I wanted to give it I wanted to do justice to it, to everyone involved. It's not my place to glorify violence. It's not my place. It's not my interest to glorify psychopathy. In fact, there's very little gore in the book at all. There's blood splatter in the very opening on the lockers, but I never describe a mangled human being, because it serves no purpose in this novel. This is a tragedy. This isn't a horror. Although I think it has horrific elements. It's very difficult. I mean, when you write about these kinds of things, and especially now, America has always been troubled by its flaws, has always been troubled by its inadequacies, has always had a kind of moral inferiority complex for some reason, has always felt like trash. Let's just say it bluntly, right? White, black, Hispanic, whatever. We all feel like secondhand goods to some extent. And it doesn't have to be that way. I don't know why that kind of insecurity with reality evolved the way it did. Maybe it has something to do with the brutality of our history. Whether you're looking at slavery in the South or you're looking at pioneers expanding, westwardly, that was a brutal experience that did not let up. That did not give them a second's rest. Indians were coming at you. Mother Nature was coming at you. You had no privileges, no luxuries. It's becoming American has been a very difficult path. And now that we live such a privileged life, everything's electrified. No one, everything is sort of just exponentially easier than it ever has been. That's why everyone's trying to come into this country, because it's not that way everywhere else. We are so lucky to live in this first world country where life is now easy, that maybe we want to forget the difficult past, and we don't. But the difficult past, of course, will bubble up into the present regardless, and because it has unfinished business, and it always will. And if we deny it, then it will only get worse. And that's my thesis. The more you deny, and I think that's a thesis of psychotherapy too. The more you deny and forget the trauma, the more the trauma dictates the activity in your life.
All right. Any closing thoughts or comments that you'd like to make about the book? Or why should people purchase No One Who Lasts Forever?
Why should people purchase it? Oh, that's a tough one to say. Because they're interested, because they're curious, because they're compelled to read something compelling. I don't know. You know, I assess myself as well as I can. The reader is a better critique of the work than I am. If they're interested, they should look into it. It is a difficult issue. It is a difficult subject. I think I handle it well. I think I pay it its due respect. And I think it's a necessary. I think we need to start. Look, there's other than we need to talk about Kevin by Lionel Shriver. I don't think there are many novels, and that one's more about the mother and her and the aftermath that the mother goes through. It's not about what makes the event happen or the events themselves. No one's touched this subject, and I understand it's a difficult thing to address, but I did, and if you want to give it a shot, please do.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me and the book club and talking about your book. So you're the first author to ever do this. So thank you for making time and creating the time to explain this amazing novel.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for having me. It's been great to get to know you on Twitter, and this was just as enjoyable as I expected it to be. So nice to see you and meet you in person, and thanks again.